Hi, I'm Sarah. For the past few weeks, I've been developing a BLE scanner app. It's now available on the Google Play Store if you'd like to check it out. Let me just go through the screenshots real quick. So it basically scans for all of your BLE devices, and you can add your devices to the favorites list. It also reads from devices, so you can read common characteristics and descriptors. And you can write to devices. Now, all of this data, as you can see, this is a generic access service with the UUID, and we've got the device name characteristic and the appearance characteristic. I'm pulling all of this information from a pre-populated room database in my app, and I pre-populated that database with Nordic Semiconductor's Bluetooth numbers database. And now that my app is live in production, this database could actually change. So my database can get stale as this continues to be updated. And I wanted to find an easy way to make updates to my app without having to rebuild my pre-populated database every time and scrub this data each time there's an update. So what I've done is I've created a fork in my repository. So I have the Bluetooth numbers database, and here I have open the characteristic UUIDs. And if you can see here in the first record, I've added a fake characteristic. So it's listed here in the same exact format. And what I've done is I've built a multi-platform Kotlin React app that basically goes out to GitHub, it scrubs this JSON file, and it compares it against my local SQLite database. So let me show you what the app looks like real quick. This is my Kotlin multi-platform web app built with React. And as you can see, I've got an image here, I've got a header, and here's my Git path. And this Git path is pulling from that forked database that I have. And I also have a different branch called Ktor testing. So I've got two options here. You can sync characteristics and you can sync descriptors. Now, just real quick, this is done with kotlin-emotion, and it's a responsive design. So if I hit inspect here, you can see as the window gets smaller, it takes up less space, so it basically responds to the width, and I change the percentage based on how wide the viewport is. Now I'll switch to the network tab and show you how this works. So I'll click Start Sync, and what it should do is it should go out to this GitHub repo, scrub the characteristics JSON file, bring it back, compare it against my local SQLite database, and if there's been any new rows added to the JSON file, then it should insert it into my database. So let's go ahead and see if it works. And it does. You can see here, I've hit my characteristics endpoint, and we come back, the update count is 1, and here's the fake characteristic that I added. So Santan Sarah, multi-platform YouTube demo, and there were no errors. So this is pretty cool stuff. Let's just take a look at this real quick. We're running on port 9090, and it's hitting the characteristics endpoint. It's always a good idea to check out the inspector and see what's going on. It really gives you a lot of insights to your web app, and it helps you debug and make sure everything's working the way it should be. While we're here in Chrome Developer Tools, let's go ahead and see what else we can look at. So I'll switch to the Sources tab, and we can see here we're running on port 9090. I have a Fonts folder, an Images folder, here's the index page, and here's the JS file, and here's an index CSS. And then down here, we can actually look at some source files, which is really cool. So we've got Kotlin wrappers, we've got our node modules, and we've got the source. And this is really interesting. Here you can see the directory structure of my multi-platform project. So I can see common main, and I can see all of my classes here. And I can see JS main, and I can see my components, my elements, my services. And then finally down here we have webpack. So I can see all the configuration needed for webpack that's loaded up. And of course you have the console. This is where you can print out any messages or see any errors or warnings. And then of course you have elements, and this is the way the page is rendered. Now let's go ahead and go through some of these elements. So here's my main div, and we'll drill down. So here's the header. Now, if you notice, each of these divs has a unique class assigned to it, and this is all coming from kotlin-emotion. And kotlin-emotion, and when everything's compiled, it does this automatically, and it puts these dynamic classes into the head. So you can see we've got data, emotion, CSS, and we've got all of our CSS defined here. And what's cool about this is these CSS styles are defined directly in your React components. So you open up a CSS block and you define all the CSS properties that you want. And they can be dynamic. You can use if statements. So depending on your app state, you can have dynamic CSS. And it's really cool stuff. I'll show you how it works in code, but I just quickly wanted to give you an overview how it works on the front end. Now let's take a look at the code. I'm here in IntelliJ, and in my source directory, I have a common main, a JS main, and a JVM main. And the JVM main stores my Ktor API. So in my resources folder, I have an application config, and here I'm setting up a few things. I set up development as true. For deployment, I make sure to watch my classes in case I make any changes. And I'm also setting my host and my port. And finally, I set up my application module, which is server KT. And now let me go into the Kotlin directory. And first, let's go over my data package. So here's my database, and this is set up with my database factory, and I create my driver class, which in this case is SQLite, and here's my database. So it's ble.db, and let's go ahead and take a look at this real quick in SQLite browser. So here's my actual database, and here's my characteristics table. And remember, from the front end, we went ahead and synced the data. So if I go into characteristics, and I go all the way down to the bottom, I should see my new record, and here we go. Here it is. So it inserted it into this local database. So back in my code, we'll go back here to IntelliJ. So this is my database factory where everything's getting set up to connect to that database and make all that magic happen. And now here I've defined the tables. So here's my characteristic table, and here's my descriptor table. And then finally, I have a DAO. And up here, I have my mappers where I map the result row to an actual data class. So here's my descriptor data class. And here's my BLE characteristics data class. Then I have a few functions to get the characteristics. So this is just querying the data from the SQLite database. And this is basically checking to see what existing records I already have. So we get the characteristics, we get the descriptors, and now here, this is the batch insert. So once I've gone out to the GitHub repository, I've found the new records, and I've compared them against my existing records, I'm going to have a list of new records. And what this function does here is it inserts all of these new records into the SQLite database. And if it's not successful, I return an error. And this is the same, it's a batch insert for descriptor. And if you've looked at some of my previous videos, this API is very similar. I have my error code set up, and I'll go ahead and show you that real quick. So I just have a little enum class and different errors for the app that can be returned in a serialized response. So that's pretty much it for the DAO. Now, if we go to remote, here's what's interesting. This is an API, but yet I actually need a client that goes out to GitHub to get the JSON data. So what I've done here is created a numbers API service. So it's an API within an API. And I set up a few defaults here. Here's my base URL. And as you can see, it's going out to my repo and my forked repository and also my branch. And I have a path for descriptors and for characteristics. So for the get characteristics function, it basically just goes out, calls that URL, gets the JSON, And then I use kotlin-X serialization to convert the string that comes back into a list of BLE characteristics. And then finally, I return the list. And then I do the same for descriptors. Next, I'll just go in order to my DI layer. I'm using Coin for dependency injection, and I just have a very simple module here. I set up my HTTP client, and I'm using the CIO engine, and I set up some logging. And here I'm just creating the numbers API service, my DAO. And then finally, these are two use cases that I have to check for new descriptors and to check for new characteristics. And I'll show you those in a second. Here in my domain layer, I have two functions that handle the API responses. So there's a sync error and then a sync success. And both of these functions are generic. So this could be a characteristic or a descriptor. And for sync error, I just pass a count of 0, an empty list, and then a list of errors. So this was that enum that I showed you before of the common errors that can happen within the API. And then if it's a success, it actually gets in the batch list of the new items that were found from the JSON, and it returns the new list count, the actual values that we saw on the front end, and then just an empty list for the errors. Now, if I go to the use cases, this is really where all of the functionality happens. So check for new characteristics. Let's go up here. So this takes in my DAO and then the API service. And then the first thing it does is it checks the local database and it pulls a record of all the characteristics from the local SQLite database. And it stores that all. And then it gets the characteristics from Git. So this actually calls the numbers API service and it gets the JSON and it stores that in a list as well. So now we've got two lists here. We've got existing characteristics from my database, and we've got the JSON from Git. And now what this does here is it basically just finds the new records. So whatever's not in one, give me a new list of just the new records. And now that I have that, if it's not empty, then I go ahead and I call my DAO and I do a batch insert on all of the new records. And finally, I return my sync error or sync success that we just saw from my domain layer. All right, so let's go ahead and close this. Now for plugins, I have content negotiation. So this is where I just have it's JSON, I install cores, and I also install some compression. And here's where I set up Coin, very simple, just install Coin. And here's my module that we saw earlier. And finally, routing. So for my routing, I basically use Coin to get my two use cases. So I've got the characteristics use case and the descriptor use case. And now I have two files that handle the routes. I've got my front end and I've got my back end. And the back end takes in these use cases. And now if we go into routes, we can see how that actually works. So for app routes, this is the back end. So here we're getting in my use cases. And here's my route to characteristics. And then I just simply call my use case and I respond with the sync response, which is either going to be that error or a success. And it's the same with descriptors. So we call the descriptors, call the use case, and send the response. Now for my front end routes, this is what handles everything from the React side. So the main route basically serves up my index page. And then we also have a static route for resources. And if you remember in the Chrome inspector, we saw that I had a fonts folder, I had a CSS file. So this route is making sure that everything in my resource package is served up to the front end. And that pretty much covers everything for the Ktor API. So let's go ahead and look at the front end and how that's configured. All of my React components are in my JS main module. So let's go ahead and explore that now. I don't have anything in the resources. We'll go into the Kotlin folder. And here's the client where everything gets set up. So we have this container and document get element by ID root. And what this is doing is pulling the div tag from the HTML file. And viewport size, that's just something I was playing around with. You all know I like to experiment. So I was just trying to see what was available to me in Kotlin and how to interact with the HTML document. And then finally, we create root. And now I render my app component and I click create and I'm passing in two props. I pass in the get path and the viewport. And here's what is so awesome about multi-platform. So this get path and this base URL that I'm passing in, if you remember, we saw that from the numbers API. And that's actually a constant that I'm defining. And my API, my Ktor API can use that value as well as the front end. So we can share code and reuse code in just one project. And it's so awesome not to have to retype classes and constants and all of that stuff. What a great way to keep everything organized and avoid mistakes. So that passes in that get path, and then I'm passing in the viewport. Here's my app component. Let's go ahead and click on this. So here I define my props, and here's that get path and the viewport. And then I go ahead and I create the app component. I open it up, I set the background color to the blue that we saw on the front end. And then I create my primary div. And the way I've organized my project, I've created some extension functions and tried to keep everything pretty organized over here. So I've got a components directory, CSS, elements, and services. So let's go ahead and look at this container CSS. This is using kotlin-emotion, and with kotlin-emotion, you can do media queries by using the selector, and then you just pass in media and then your cutoff point. So I've created 3 cutoff points for desktop, tablet, and mobile. And then here I create my extension function for container CSS, and I create a CSS block. And I set up all of the CSS properties that I need. And for my width, it's going to be 50% if it's greater than 1240. But otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and use these properties. So if it's desktop, I want the width to be 70. If it's tablet, I want it to be 80. And if it's mobile, I want it to be 90. So as we're getting the screen smaller and smaller, the div is going to get bigger and bigger and fill up more of the web browser page. Now let's go back to the app component. So I've got another header component, which is in here. And that's just very simple. Again, I'm using kotlin-emotion for my CSS. And I set up my image, and I set up an h1 tag. And then this is a function, get path. This is just rendering that get path. So I know whether I'm in development or whether I'm in the actual numbers database that's on Nordics repository. And then back up here, I just have a little divider in the page. And now I set up my characteristics component. So that's in here. I don't have any properties. Now here, this is really cool. I can use coroutines. So I set up my scope is main scope. I create my React component. And then I set up my sync response. This is what comes back from the Ktor API. And I use state so I can go ahead and save it. And I have a function here on sync. And then I launch the scope. So this is a suspend function that goes out to my Ktor API. So it goes out to the JVM main code, and it brings back the sync response when it checks for new characteristics. So let's go ahead and see how this API is being called from the front end. So if I go into my services folder, I've got API defined. And then I have a JSON client, which is just a Ktor HTTP client. So here I have my suspend function, sync characteristics. So it returns a sync response of a BLE characteristic. And again, we're using the same code from the API in the front end, which is super cool. And let me just show you real quick. In common main, I have a lot of these things defined. So these are my app error codes that return from the Ktor API. These are my BLE models. So I've got my characteristics and my descriptors. These are my constants. We saw this. This is that base URL. And then I have the responses. This is my generic data class, which is serialized. So this could be a characteristic or a descriptor. And then these are the response errors, which returns the error code from the API. And then finally, I just have a basic result class. We've all seen this before, either success or error. So now let's go back to my API service. So we go out, we get this sync response from the Ktor backend, and it returns the JSON client, and it returns the body, and then it prints it out to the front end. So we'll go back to my characteristics component here. And so this is the onSync function, and then we have a sync item. And what I've done is I've called this an element because it's a div tag and I wanted to be able to reuse it for characteristics and descriptors. So we'll go over here into my elements folder. And here's my sync item. So this is just an extension function off of Children Builder. So we have a sync item. I'm sending in my title, which could be characteristic or descriptor. I'm sending in the response string, which is what's coming back from the Ktor API. And then here's my onSync function. So it creates the div, sets up my CSS, and then creates the button. And again, this is just another element. We can look at that real quick. So the button has some custom CSS, and then it basically invokes that onSync function that we defined in the characteristics component. And we'll go back here real quick. So then we create the text area, and then this stores the response that comes back from the Ktor API. I think that pretty much covers, that pretty much covers the characteristics component. And that's a really good overview of how the app is structured. And what I found really interesting is what the heck is going on behind the scenes. So we're using kotlin-emotion for the CSS. We've got node modules. We're using React. How is Multiplatform handling all of this? Well, for starters, let me just show you in common main. This is where I've set up all of my resources. So here's the static index file, and here's the div, and here's the main root. And this is where we're injecting all of the functionality into. And then I also defined an index CSS. What's really cool about kotlin-emotion is you can also define existing class names along with additional CSS properties. So if I already have a class name in here, I can define it in my code and then expand upon that for each element if I'd like to. So it's cool that you can mix the two together. And then I have a font. I'm using Open Sans for this project. And I've got some images. This is the logo, basically, that shows up in the header. So we've got our multi-platform project, and we have all of these modules. We've got main, we've got data classes, we've got Ktor APIs, and we have front ends. What the heck is going on behind the scenes? Well, if you look at the build folder, there's some really cool stuff that you can check out. Under distributions, we've got the fonts directory, images, the JS file, so here's all my static resources. And then if we go into JS, this is really cool. We can see the node modules. So we've got everything that's loaded up in here. And then we've got packages, and we've got our package JSON. So if you ever want to check out what's going on with that, you can go ahead and go in here, check it out. And then we've got our yarn lock. And this reminds me of basically webpack configuration. So how do we do that? What you do is in your root directory, you create a package called webpack-config.d. And in here, I have a webpack.config.js. Now this is really tricky. Notice here, you're not creating a typical React front end that you would do in JavaScript. This is a little bit different. So I have config.devserver.host, and then I have a host defined here. This is my custom Webpack configuration, but let's see what the run task is doing behind the scenes. I can search for Webpack, And as we can see, this is in build.js packages and then my project name. So this is the actual webpack.config.js that's being generated when you build your project. And as we can see here, we have a variable that's created, let config equal. So that's where I'm pulling in my custom configuration. That's where I'm getting this config.devserver.host from. So we'll go back here. And this is, if you're just curious about how all this works, this is a great way to go in and see what's going on. So you can see how everything's defined. You can see if you need to customize anything further. And if you can see down here, it'll make a little comment. So here's where I've added my custom config. So we can see this was added in dynamically. And this brings me to another point, which is the Gradle configuration. You can also define some of these settings in your Gradle build file. So let's go into here and see what's going on with this. This is standard. You just create your plugins. So we're multi-platform. This is my application, and we're using serialization. Get my repositories. Now this is where you define all of your modules. So we've got the JVM. I'm running on JVM target 17 here. JS, this is all of your front end settings. So here, if we open up this browser block, we can set up common webpack config. And I'm setting my mode to development. And here I'm creating a server. So I create a server port 8080. And notice, if you remember, my Ktor API is running on port 9090, and my front end is running on 8080. And then I set up a proxy to basically convert everything to 9090. And this is so I can run my Ktor API separately. So I can go ahead and run the API, and then I can run a separate task to load my front end and make sure that I have hot reloads enabled when I make changes to the CSS or whatever, to the components. So I've configured this webpack here, and if we go back into the JS file that's generated, so we can see my mode is development. And then we should be able to see the dev server. Yep, here it is down here. So port 8080. And then here's my proxy that I've defined in my Gradle file. Pretty cool stuff. As far as Gradle tasks go, there's really two key ones that you need to worry about. So let's go into tasks here. Application run. And the other important one is if you go to Kotlin browser and you want JS browser development run. And if you run that in continuous mode, you can make changes to your front end and all of your React components, and the browser is going to use Webpack to go ahead and hot reload and refresh the browser, which is really cool. And it's a little bit tricky to get this up and running, especially if you want to have your Ktor API running in the background. So let me go ahead and show you how I've set this up. So I'll go into my terminal. And now, as you've seen, I've set up my API to run on port 9090 and my front end to work on port 8080. And what that allows me to do is basically create two instances where I can run them both, and I won't have any issues when I run saying that the port's already in use and stuff like that. So the first thing I just need to do is hit Gradle, and we're going to do run. So we'll fire up the Ktor API here. Okay, the task is finished, and my Ktor API is now running on port 9090. So let's go ahead and click that. And it loads up the entire application, and everything should be running and working good now. So let's go back into IntelliJ, start a new terminal, and this time we're going to do Gradle, and we're going to do JS browser development run, and we're going to do -- continuous, and go ahead and run that. Okay, this task is finished, and automatically we get the browser opened. And as you can see here, we have it running on port 8080. So this is going to be our hot development server where we can go into our front end and make some changes. So let's go into the characteristic component. And we'll just say sync YouTube. And now let's go back to my browser. So we'll have to give this a minute. It does take a little bit of time. I'm still researching how to speed this process up a little bit. But in a minute here, we should get an auto refresh. And there we go. So sync YouTube. So that's basically how you can get your API and your front end working simultaneously and be able to do continuous reloads. So we've got the back end loaded here. We've got the front end loaded here. And back in IntelliJ, we've got 2 terminals open. And we can just easily get out of these whenever we want. And we'll close this out. And this is great too, because as you can see here, I get all of my logs too on my API. So we'll cancel this one as well. And that is pretty much it for my multi-platform video. I absolutely love it. I can't believe how cool it was to be able to create everything all in Kotlin, my backend, my front end, to be able to share resources back and forth. And it was so much fun to see how everything was compiled and created in my build. And I can't wait to do some more projects. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.